Um, well, I'm Giraud. I'm a documentary photographer, and I have a very, very short presentation, about 6 or 7 slides that I'm going to go through, highlighting my latest body of work, which it centers around landscapes on two different countries, Iceland and also in Canada, actually, around Nova Scotia. So what I'm going to do is share the screen right now and then share my PowerPoint presentation. And I believe we'll have some time for questions before your next presenter um, is due to present here. So please bear with me now. I'm sharing my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that. And I'm going to get into PowerPoint mode. Again, my name is Giraud Polite, and I'm happy to be here. My last name looks like Polite as in manners, but it's pronounced Polite in case you were wondering. But of course, everybody knows me by Giraud, so you don't have to remember that. Um, for 2 decades, my photographic work centered more around the human condition than landscape photography, sometimes tediously telling or retelling stories from my point of view, enjoying photographer's privilege, being unremarkable and undisturbed while shooting um, as an almost invisible provocateur of some sorts. I find a different type of satisfaction now when shooting landscapes. People are complicated. You find yourself mostly on their time. You may be out of your element on foreign soil. Essentially, you're an unknown quantity. My belief is when shooting people or things that people are directly connected to, that documentarians have an obligation to work with integrity and tell their story, serving both as artist and editor, depending on the space, landscapes are untethered. Respects to photographic principles, I consider the extremes of negative space, proportion, and proximity in all of my work. Landscape photography lend more to exploring these principles due to its built-in space and depth, as well as its lack of inherent parameters in documentary photography work, such as human skin tone. You don't have to worry about those things. In terms of the process, once captured and cataloged in my digital darkroom, my priority is to photographic contrast, first and foremost. I strive to create frames that are filled with dynamic tension by pushing the limits of my shadows and highlights. Now, this stems from my background of 20 plus years of shooting and editing film and video, as well as my fascination with sci-fi movies such as Gattaca and Sin City, to name a few or name a couple. I strive to create, embellish a cinematic look and feel throughout my work. In terms of extension or challenging of the traditional genres, this filmic look has informed my work. So I strive to make the ordinary, mysterious, or unearthly. In every image, I aim to create the notion that there is a before and after frame, or much more to the micro narrative. In creating the final print, it may be black and white or color, or on paper or digitally for the web, depending on the context. And when editing for a story, the images usually determine if they're worthy of printing on paper or some other substrate such as birch, metal, or fiberglass. I look to print primarily in the 16:9 ratio, depending on the shape of the main objects within the frame. In a 2013 interview, master photographer Sebastião Salgado said of photography, quote, "I discovered that photography is an incredible language. It was possible to move my camera and capture with my camera and to communicate with images. It was a language that didn't need any translation because photography can be read in many different languages. I can write in photography and I can read in China, in Canada, in Brazil, anywhere." Now, close quotes. Now, traveling is in my bloodstream. My father, who lives in LA right now, has traveled to several countries, I think at 111 to this date. And he travels for different reasons. I shoot simply because I'm curious curious at the fact that, there's different type of people that have, unique stories across this planet. And photography allows me to satisfy that curiosity in a most succinct manner in delivery. So I'm not trying to change the world with my images. I'm merely curious about the actual art form. And it does allow me to find out a little bit about myself and my community. I'm going to stop sharing right now and open up for any questions you guys may have.
Giraud, I have a few questions that came in earlier, so maybe we can start with those.
Absolutely.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. All right. I have a couple questions. Let's see. How about this question relates to some of your earlier work, because I shared URLs, everyone's URLs with the students. And the question, this person says, I love your images of the crawfish circuit, your landscapes, although they have completely different content, have the same balance of energy with introspection. Are there similarities in the way you approach these projects?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I kind of enjoy the departure from, being tethered, to a community or a face. But as far as the process and, the elements that are within the frame, they are quite different. When you have a moving, breathing object that has his or her mind, of their own, it's quite a challenging, more of a challenge, I should say, than working with a mountain or a lake or a pasture, a field of daisies, etc. In that context, things are quite different. But once I get into the digital darkroom, I think contrast, first and foremost, is something that I focus on. Again, because of some of my references to some of the sci-fi movies that I discussed earlier. I attempt to achieve this filmic look in my work, very, very deep shadows and brilliant highlights. So overall, in post, that's something that's compelling to me. But in the act, I think that the process is different because of the actual subject matter. It's kind of inherent in the topics that I choose to attack it, with my camera apparatus.
Cool. I have another question that came in earlier. This is about a response to your image, Church Mountain from Iceland. It's a beautiful landscape. And this student really loved how the almost warped nature of the image that the image takes on as it encompasses sky and ground. And do you intentionally seek out such landscapes? And why were you drawn to this one in particular?
Actually drawn to that one because I first encountered it in Prometheus. The movie, I think, was produced and directed by Ridley Scott right at the beginning. And it was kind of an Instagram sensation. And I'm not a big follower of Instagram, but this particular image, kind of started to bubble up on social media years ago, not only because of Prometheus, then again, it was shown again in Game of Thrones. And I just was fortunate enough to travel to Iceland. And if you guys have not traveled, it's just a picturesque postcard scene around every corner. And that particular mountain, I've always wanted to see with my own eyes. But to answer your question, yes, it just so happens I did happen to be in the perfect place for that particular image. It's very difficult, especially in Dallas, to find picturesque scenes similar to that particular mountain in Iceland. But along my travels, I usually do some pre-planning, some research, and I will look for, specifically on the internet, some of the hot spots where tourists go and some of the not so known picturesque landscapes to travel to and capture. So in the form of, in terms of that particular image, that was kind of a happy accident that I happened to be there, really traveling there to see the waterfalls in the Blue Lagoon. And the mountain was pretty far, but I had an opportunity. I had some time to travel to that particular location.
Great.
Thank you for the question.
Great. Let's see, would anyone like to share a question? Okay, here's a question from Amal.
Hey, Mo.
I don't know if you can see that question from Amal, but it says, is human skin ever completely absent from landscape photography as a genre? How about landscapes that are associated with certain nations?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the last word.
The question is in the chat. I don't know if you can scroll down and see that.
Yeah, let me try to get to that real quick.
Yeah.
Here.
Yeah.
Panel.
There's a little chat button right in the middle of your screen.
Yeah, and I should know this because I'm using this almost every day for work. And human skin, completely just disappeared.
It says, is human skin ever completely absent from landscape photography as a genre? How about landscapes that are associated with certain nations?
With certain nations. If you guys look at my work from the crawfish circuit, I mean, there are some landscape imagery in the picture, but looking at my work from Iceland, as well as Canada, that was intentional. In the crawfish circuit, that was kind of a long-term project, and I wanted to connect the people with the land. So there are some images that include individuals, and I think it's just based on the story. It was the photographer's intention, my intention, to capture the land void of people in my latest body of work. So that's a good question, but I think it's just depends on the intention of the photographer. So from the crawfish circuit to my most recent body of work, I made the creative decision to not include people.
There's another question. I don't know if you could see it, but it kind of relates to an earlier one about your response to Iceland. Says many of this images seem to have quite a bit of distortion or warping. This is similar to a previous question, but it goes on. The question says, is this intentional or just the result of using a wide angle lens? So this emphasis on distortion.
That's a good question. I travel at times with groups of photographers, and we usually challenge each other to shoot with one lens for today. And and it solves several problems. I mean, obviously, camera equipment can be quite heavy. And also it sometimes it serves as a learning tool. And I think for the majority of my images, I use one fixed focus prime lens, which was a 35 millimeter. And sometimes I will use a 20 millimeter. So you're probably thinking more of the 20 millimeter lens, or images that was shot with the 20 millimeter lens with a wider focus lens, angle lens.
Cool. Great.